Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Taz Stacey, aka TasFromTas on Reddit. I'm just going to put a bit here for our new listeners. I'm going to assume most people are already familiar with what this is, but just in case you've come through us through the podcast world rather than through the Reddit world, this is a podcast put together by the moderators of the Ask Historians forum on Reddit. You can visit us on AskHistorians.reddit.com. At the moment, we are the largest history forum on the internet. At time of recording, we had about 230,000 subscribed users. What is it? Basically, it's a place where anyone can come and ask a question and have a reasonable chance at an expert giving them an answer. We have about 300 flared users right now. What's a flared user? A flared user is someone who's been able to demonstrate in the past that they have a decent understanding of the topic, that they're able to engage with the primary and secondary sources, and they're able to give a lot more insight than someone would if they just sort of Googled around and were reading sources without necessarily understanding the context that surrounds them and the latest sort of scholarship that's been done. History is an always developing field, and just because something was current when you first read it, in the 1980s, doesn't mean it still is, even though you might be talking about events that happened hundreds or even thousands of years in the past. So anyway, on the podcast, we're going to try something different this week. In the past, we've shown interviews with flared user, and we've had a flared user talking about an area of their expertise, and definitely going down the track, that's what we hope sort of the majority of the podcasts will be. But today we're going to try and answer reading. So user Idjit is going to read the questions, and I am going to read the answers as written by another user. So this isn't my answer. This isn't TasFromTas's answer. This is someone else's answer. I'm just reading it. I'm still fiddling with my recording setup here at home as well. Hopefully it's sounding a bit better each week. This is not something that I'm particularly good at, but we'll see how it goes. Trying to strike a balance between getting something that's easy to listen to and not having to spend a heap of money on expensive mics and so on and so forth. So remember to leave your comments and feedback in the discussion thread, not just about the content that we're talking about, but I guess the tone and the delivery method. That's actually really important to putting together a good podcast, and I want to hear your thoughts and comments, so on and so forth. All right, moving on. So this answer is by user SnickeringShadow, who is an expert in Mesoamerican archaeology and the Tarascan Empire. One of the things with this answer is that it contains a lot of difficult to pronounce names. SnickeringShadow very helpfully provided me with a pronunciation guide, but I still think that I've done not a great job with it. I pause sometimes just before it because I'm going to my pronunciation guide and things, but I try to make it sound as natural as I can. Why this answer? When the concept of the podcast was first sort of kicked around by the moderators, one of the things I thought I really wanted to read out this particular answer because it's written in a conversational style. It's on a very popular topic. It's one of the questions that comes up a lot on the forum, and it's one of the big questions. I've always wondered it myself. Why on earth would you surrender if you knew that you're awaiting certain painful death? One more caveat with this. There was a bunch of answers by user 400 Rabbits in this same thread, but I haven't read out any of them. But that's not because they weren't good answers or anything like that. It's just because I wanted to sort of focus on one particular user this week. And I've got 400 Rabbits as one of the first cabs off the rank with the interviews coming up. So hopefully in the next few episodes, you'll hear my interview with him. Assuming it's a him. Who knows? You never can tell on the internet, can you? Alright, so onward.
Were human sacrifices in Mesoamerican societies voluntary, or were they slaves? Was it honorable to be sacrificed?
Man, this is a complicated question. It largely depends on what you mean by voluntary. With a few specific exceptions, most sacrifices were captive enemy soldiers who were taken in battle. Among many Mesoamerican cultures, capturing an enemy in battle for sacrifice was a kind of rite of passage for warriors. Maya nobility, for example, would take the name of their first captive as an epithet. For example, so-and-so, sacred king of city, captor of what's-his-face. Capturing an enemy nobleman was of prime importance, as this altered the political relationship between the two cities, and noble blood was considered more potent. In Aztec culture, taking captives was a way for commoners to advance in society. Taking a captive in battle made you an adult, and if you could capture enough enemy soldiers for sacrifice, you could be recruited into one of the prestigious military orders, and possibly even earn you a noble title. So within warfare there was a strong incentive to take captives. While it was quite common to simply kill opponents on the battlefield, an ambitious soldier would try to incapacitate his opponent and take him back to his home city to be killed later. However, not all sacrifices were prisoners of war, some were slaves or even commoners, and in one particularly gruesome ritual, children. The exact criteria for which sacrifices were chosen varied depending on the culture in question, the god being honoured, and the specific sacrificial ritual. In the case of prisoners of war, I don't think you could really call that voluntary, in the sense that nobody wants to get captured and sacrificed. But in a sense it was, as the captive soldier was presumably trying to do the same thing to his opponent. When a soldier gets called to war and marches out to battle, he knows that he might die. That's simply part of war. The only difference in this case is that the actual dying part is postponed for a while. In other cases, when sacrifices were chosen from other segments of the population, i.e. slaves, I think it would be difficult to call it a voluntary arrangement. Slaves were typically purchased for this occasion. As for your second question about honour in sacrifice, I would say the answer is yes, sacrifice was considered honourable. But the specifics vary from culture to culture. In general, Mesoamerican people saw their relationship with the gods as a reciprocal one that involved the exchange of vital energies. The gods expended energy by bringing rains, providing sunlight or fertile soil for crops. Humans consumed this energy by eating, breathing, etc. Many Mesoamerican creation myths describe deities sacrificing themselves to create or sustain the mortal world. Because of this, humans are indebted to the gods and had to return energy to them. There were a number of ways this could be done, such as burning incense, sacrificing animals, or spilling some of your own blood. But the ultimate way humans returned energy to the gods was by dying. When a human died, their energy returned to the earth. In a sense, we eat from the earth and the earth eats us. Among the Aztecs, people selected for sacrifice were ritually cleansed and adorned in garments and insignia of the deity to whom they were to be sacrificed. In this process, the sacrificial victim became an Ashipla, a deity impersonator. From their perspective, the sacrificial victim became the earthly incarnation of that deity as long as he fulfilled that role. After the ritual was complete, the skull of the victim was often removed and placed in a skull rack near the temple. The femurs, thighs of the victim, were taken to the home of the sponsor of the sacrifice, typically the person who captured him, where they were hung on the wall during a feast that honoured the victim. The flesh of the thigh bones was usually eaten by the captor at this feast. Cannibalism tends to freak people out, but they didn't see this as insulting. Quite the contrary, it was a means by which the captor could partake of the sacrifice's gift. We have less historical sources on sacrifice outside of the Aztecs, but archaeological and iconographic evidence paints a similar picture. Burials of human sacrifices among many Mesoamerican cultures are found with disarticulated skulls and femurs, which suggests that the Aztec practice of removing these parts of the body has a long tradition in Mesoamerica. Other forms of sacrifice appear to have been more popular in the Classic period, but fell out of popularity by the time of the Aztecs. Ritual decapitation is a good example of this. It appears among the Maya and at Teotihuacan, but is not common in the post-Classic. Maya sacrifices appear to have occurred following a post-battle parade that might be considered roughly analogous to a Roman triumph. The hieroglyphic inscriptions describe a ritual known to epigraphers as Na, that victims underwent prior to sacrifice. It's unclear what this is exactly, but it might involve torture and/or bloodletting. There are some weird impact notches to the outer surface of the ribs of some sacrificial victims that may have been formed during this ritual. Like with the Aztecs, Maya sacrificial victims were, quote, honoured, unquote. But the main point is to elevate the prestige of the person capturing him. When sacrificial victims are depicted in stelae, they are shown bound, kneeling, and sometimes naked. Their submissive depiction is set in strong contrast to depictions of their captors, who are standing, armed, and decorated in elaborate regalia. This artistic representation of captives is also echoed among the Zapotec culture of southern Mexico, where images of sacrificial victims were carved into stone slabs known today as danzantes. These carvings depict victims in a post-mortem grimace, often with graphic, although highly stylized, depictions of blood and organs. They are also naked, and some of the earliest danzantes were found face up at temple entrances, so you'd literally have to walk over them to enter the temple. Combined, this seems to show that the purpose of such carvings was to reinforce the dominance of the victorious group, and the submissive nature of those who were defeated. Among the Tarascans, human sacrifice appears to largely follow the Aztec model. Disarticulated skulls and femurs found in archaeological contexts indicate that the ritual practices were similar to those of the Aztecs. The historical records appear to indicate, we don't know for sure, that early in the empire's history the Tarascans engaged in ritual warfare for the purposes of collecting sacrifices, similar to the Aztec flower wars, although this seems to have been largely ceased by the time the Spanish arrived. The largest difference between the Tarascans and the Aztecs on this practice is that the Tarascans appears to have used sacrifice as a punitive measure as well. Towns or cities that did not resist were spared, but if a city put up a particularly strong defence, the Tarascans would often sacrifice people en masse. The historical records, and again not sure how much we can trust these here, indicate that when a hostile town or city fell, the wounded, infants and elderly were sacrificed on the spot, and the remaining soldiers were taken back to the capital to be sacrificed later. This appears to have been a form of collective punishment aimed to encourage other towns to surrender without fighting. I've got a partial list of sources here for further reading. Linda Scheel wrote Human Sacrifice Among the Classic Maya, Ritual Human Sacrifice in Mesoamerica. Then there was a book by Mike Smith, The Aztecs, published in 2003, and a journal article called The Human Skeletal Remains of the Moon Pyramid, Teotihuacan, by Gregory Piera and Michael W. Spence. And finally, there's a journal article called Procedures in Human Heart Extraction and Ritual Meaning, a Taphonomic Assessment of Anthropogenic Marks in Classic Maya Skeletons, by Kuchina and Tiesler in 2006.
When you say many Mesoamerican creation myths describe deities sacrificing themselves to create and or sustain the mortal world, what do you think of Koyoshaki in relation to this idea? She is depicted in the Templo Mayor disc in a manner resembling ritual sacrifice, and her head becomes the moon, even though she wasn't really killed as a sacrifice.
Koyoshaki's death, as you may know, was brought about by the war god Huitzilopochtli shortly after his birth. She was Huitzilopochtli's sister, and she and her 400 other siblings were angry at their mother for being pregnant with Huitzilopochtli. This is kind of confusing. It sounds to me like they thought she'd been fooling around, even though Huitzilopochtli was conceived without a father. Koyoshaki planned to murder her mother, but when Huitzilopochtli found out he supposedly burst forth from his mother's womb, fully grown and armed to the teeth, and subsequently slaughtered and dismembered his sibling. To put it simply, Koyoshaki's death wasn't a sacrifice in the strict sense of the word, but more of a fight or battle. However, given the close association of war and sacrifice in Aztec culture, you could draw a loose connection.
I might be a horrible person for asking, but can you tell me more about the particularly gruesome child sacrifice ritual?
The rationale behind child sacrifice to the rain god Tlaloc was that the tears of the children created a kind of sympathetic magic, to use the anthropological term, to bring rain. Since rain clouds were believed to originate in the mountains, these sacrifices often took place on mountaintop shrines surrounding the Valley of Mexico. This frequently took place on a mountain called Lalacan, named after the supernatural realm over which Tlaloc ruled. Apparently the ritual was an annual event that was attended by royalty, nobility and priests. This was all done during the first month of the solar calendar, Alcahualco. My notes put the dates for this at February 14 through to March 5, but the Aztecs didn't have a leap year, so the dates in our calendar don't always sync up. This is not the only ritual dedicated to Tlaloc. The large twin-peaked pyramid in the centre of Tenochtitlan, Templo Mayor, had one of its two shrines dedicated to Tlaloc, where the more traditional sacrifices, cutting out of hearts and such, were performed. Sacrifices dedicated to Tlaloc took place between midnight and dawn.
Just how were people sacrificed? What kind of tools and weapons were used?
This is actually a matter of some dispute, and the practice could have varied from culture to culture. In all cases, stone knives, usually obsidian, but in some cultures flint, were the tool of choice. Incisions could have been made horizontally beneath the rib cage, allowing the priest to remove the heart by going up through the diaphragm. This would in turn cause the lungs to collapse, rendering the victim unconscious. If this technique was used, it would not have left much evidence to the bones themselves. A few skeletons that show cut marks associated with sacrifice appear to indicate that the priests used forceful blows to the sternum to separate it, allowing priests to open the rib cage from the front. However, Tiesler and Kuchina, 2006, argue for the diaphragm approach based on some impact marks on the left side of the lower thoracic vertebrae. It's complicated and it hasn't been confirmed. Source here is Archaeology Procedures in Human Heart Extraction and Ritual Meaning, a Taphonomic Assessment of Anthropogenic Marks in Classic Maya Skeletons, appearing in Latin American Antiquity by Tiesler and Kuchina, 2006.
Okay, that sounds awfully painful. Were there any kinds of restraints to stop the victims from struggling, or is that impossible to determine?
There were 4 priests whose job it was to hold the arms and legs of the victims down, while a 5th priest removed the heart. Among the Aztecs at least, it was also common for victims to get drunk first. There was typically a prohibition in Aztec society against drunkenness, but it was thankfully waived in this instance.
When you say, among many Mesoamerican cultures, capturing an enemy in battle for sacrifice was kind of a rite of passage for warriors, and that it made you an adult. Well, I understand how this works for a smaller group, like nobles and individuals of uncommon prestige, but talking about the population more broadly, the math seems impossible. Taking an enemy captive for sacrifice as some precondition for adulthood seems like it would put an impossible demand on the population. My instinct says this was your simplification for the sake of a brief answer. So what's the longer answer about social advancement through capture of prisoners? Was it really something every fighter was expected to do? Were prisoners taken and not sacrificed, perhaps for slavery or ransom? And if a Mesoamerican warrior doesn't ever take a prisoner, was that just an undistinguished career, or was it actually shameful?
The Aztecs, among whom this custom was prevalent, were kind of an extreme case. Other Mesoamerican cultures like the Maya treated warfare and the taking of captives as a largely aristocratic affair. The Mexica, the core Aztec ethnic group, were a proportionately small population that established hegemony over a much larger population. The math makes sense when you think of it that way. If one were to draw a comparison to Old World empires, you could make the analogy to how many people were subject to Roman dominance versus how many people were actually Roman citizens. This custom of taking captives as a rite of passage served as an ideology for imperial expansion. Essentially, the Mexica were in a constant state of war. It came to the point where they would even start wars specifically to take captives. They called this a flower war. If you're interested in learning more about the varying Mesoamerican customs regarding war, I'd recommend the following books: War and Society in Ancient Mesoamerica by Ross Hassig, and Aztec Warfare, Imperial Expansion and Political Control, also by Ross Hassig. He's kind of the premier military historian for this period.
How large were Mesoamerican armies?
They could get very large. The largest army recorded was assembled by Moctezuma during a war between the Aztecs and the city-state known as Coxitlahuaca. Supposedly this army numbered around 200,000 soldiers. This may be an exaggeration, but Hassig argues that the Aztecs were capable of fielding an army this large at this time based on demographics. Cortes also reports the number of indigenous allies that fought with him against the Aztecs during the siege of Tenochtitlan was over 100,000. There was also the famous Aztec-Tarascan War of 1476. Prior to this point, the Tarascans were the largest empire in Mesoamerica. Then the Aztecs reconquered the Toluca Valley and launched a full-scale invasion of the Tarascan Empire with the aim of capturing the Tarascan capital, Tzintzuntzan. The upper estimates for the size of the Aztec army during this war were around 30,000 soldiers. Unfortunately for them, the Tarascans ambushed them across the border with a much larger army of up to 50,000 soldiers. The Tarascans not only had a numerical advantage and favourable terrain, but they also relied heavily on bows and arrows as weapons, which gave them a tactical advantage over the Aztecs, whose ranged weapon of choice was the javelin driven by an atlatl. They killed or captured roughly 90% of the Aztec army, and their Spanish describe being able to see the bones still littering the battlegrounds decades later. However, many other Mesoamerican battles were also much smaller in scale, limited to raiding or ritual warfare. This is especially true amongst those societies where warfare was much more elite-focused, as commoners were typically only brought in as support.
Can you tell me more about those military orders?
There were 4 Aztec military orders: the Huaychique, the Otontine, the Ocelome, and the Cuauhtin. The latter 2 were open to commoners, and the former were restricted to nobility. The Aztecs did not have a standing army. Commoners received military training from a young age, but they still had to conscript troops in the event of wars. The military orders were the only professional soldiers they had. Each order had a distinctive costume that they would lay over quilted cotton armour. They managed their own recruitment and would only accept men who had proven their worth in combat by capturing many sacrifices. If I recall correctly, you needed 4 captives before you could be considered.
Were Europeans ever sacrificed?
Yes. During the Battle of La Noche Triste, the Aztecs sacrificed many of the conquistadors who were not fortunate enough to escape with Cortes. The Maya also sacrificed several members of the expedition that brought Geronimo de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero to the Yucatan.
When I think of Mesoamerica, I think of large swaths of jungle, obviously not ideal terrain for moving about and fighting 50,000 men. Where did the battles actually take place?
While all of Mesoamerica is in the tropics, in the sense that it's between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, not all of it is tropical in vegetation or climate. The very high mountains in the region provide a range of climates. Locally, the climate is divided between the Tierra Caliente, the hotlands of the tropical lowlands, the Tierra Templada, the temperate lands are located in the mountain valleys, and the Tierra Fria, or cold lands near the mountain peaks themselves. The Tarascan Empire was located on the western end of the central Mexican plateau. The Aztecs were defeated just outside of Tashimaroa. I don't know the exact elevation offhand, but I'd guess somewhere around 7,000 feet above sea level. The environment there is typically Mediterranean deciduous forest, oak, pine and willow mostly. The other thing to keep in mind is that the thick forests, tropical or otherwise, are fairly recent. In pre-columbian times, the land was more or less as cleared as it is today. Ancient farmers transformed the landscape quite extensively. In many areas, demographic collapses caused former farmlands to go wild, and after centuries it's turned into forest.
What did it mean for a commoner to be inducted into an order? Was it comparable to knighthood?
Kind of. Being part of a military order was certainly more prestigious than being a farmer or craftsman, but it didn't constitute a noble title. There was a title that I think you could roughly equate with knight, Quaupile, or Eagle Lord. This was a non-inheritable title that could be conferred on a commoner for military or civil service. The class was abolished by Moctezuma II, however.
Which Europeans witnessed human sacrifice and lived to tell the tale? What was their take on it?
I'll give you Diaz del Castillo's account when he witnessed it from a distance during the siege of Tenochtitlan. They had just been beaten back by the Aztecs and had retreated to a safe place when again there was sounded the dismal drum of Huitzilopochtli, and many shells and horns and things like trumpets, and the sound of them all was terrifying, and we all looked towards the lofty pyramid where they were being sounded, and saw that our comrades whom they had captured when they defeated Cortes were being carried by force up the steps, and they were taking them to be sacrificed. When they got them up to a small square in front of the oratory, where their accursed idols were kept, we saw them place plumes on the heads of many of them, and with things like fans in their hands they forced them to dance before Huitzilopochtli. After they had danced, they immediately placed them on their backs on some rather narrow stones which had been prepared as places for sacrifice, and with stone knives they sawed open their chests and drew out their palpitating hearts and offered them to the idols that were there. And they kicked the bodies down the steps, and Indian butchers who were waiting below cut off the arms and feet and flayed the skin off the faces. The rest of the quote after where I cut off is mostly Diaz's imagination, but you get the picture. They were quite terrified. Alright, so that was SnickeringShadow's series of answers and to a bunch of very interesting questions about Mesoamerican sacrifice. I'd like to thank SnickeringShadow again for giving us permission to read out his answer, and I'd like to thank user Idjit again for reading the questions. I'll post up the discussion thread and you'll be able to see a link to the original thread in question, but you'll also be able to have the opportunity to post any follow-up questions there, and hopefully our Mesoamerican users will be able to fill you in, even if SnickeringShadow may or may not be around. So yes, let us know what you think of this particular format, and as always, join us on AskHistorians.reddit.com and keep the questions coming. Cheers, guys.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.